Good morning and welcome, First Church family and friends. I am so glad to be gathering with you today wherever you are. I'm excited that we have an opportunity to worship together. No matter where you are, we believe and we know that Jesus is here. So just a couple of things. Let me remind you that you can visit our church website at CherokeeFCC.com to find out more about us as a church. Also, we encourage you to click on the links provided on whichever platform you're viewing the service today to fill out a digital Connect card and to give financially if you feel led to do that. We also encourage you to connect by engaging in the online chat. If you're viewing this morning via our church online platform, just type the word hello there in the chat box and let us know you're here. Also, feel free to submit a prayer request or to ask any questions you may have. Again, I am excited because it is going to be a great time together. In just a little bit, I'm going to be sharing the first message from a new series entitled Daniel and the Dudes Who Dared to Be Different. You know, the life of Daniel is one of the most unusual biographies in the entire Bible. And today we're going to look at some of the decisions that Daniel made that made him such a godly man and such a faithful servant of God. I believe that God has something to say to each one of us on this topic. And so sit back and get ready to lean into what God has in store for us. It is going to be an amazing time, and I'm so glad that you are here.
We're starting off by worshiping with our mouths, connect that with our hearts, and sing together. Are you singing sweet worship? We worship the God who was. We worship the God who is. We worship the God who evermore will be. He opened the prison doors. He parted the raging sea. My God, He holds the victory. Oh, that's joy. There's joy in the house of the Lord. There's joy in the house of the Lord today. We won't be quiet. We shout your praise. There's joy in the house of the Lord. Our God is surely in this place. We won't be quiet. We shout your praise. We sing to the God who heals. We sing to the God who saves. We sing to the God who always makes a way. 'Cause He hung up on that cross, then He rose up from that grave. My God, still rolling stones away. There's joy. There's joy in the house of the Lord. There's joy in the house of the Lord today. We won't be quiet. We shout out your praise. There's joy in the house of the Lord. Our God is surely in this place. We won't be quiet. We shout out your praise. We were the beggars, and now we're royalty. We were the prisoners, and now we're running free. We are forgiven, accepted, redeemed by His grace. So let the house of the Lord sing. Come on, let's sing that like you mean it with the band. We were the beggars, now we're royalty. We are the prisoners, now we're free. Now we're running free. We are forgiven, accepted, redeemed by His grace. So let the house of the Lord sing praise. Come on, lift your voice, everybody sing. There's joy in the house of the Lord. There's joy in the house of the Lord today. We won't be quiet. We shout out your praise. There's joy in the house of the Lord. Our God is surely in this place. We won't be quiet. We shout out so much joy. There's joy in the house of the Lord. There's joy in the house of the Lord today. We won't be quiet. We and I will watch the darkness flee. Yes, I will. And I raise a hallelujah in the middle of the mystery. Yeah, I raise a hallelujah. Feel you lost now. Feel you lost your hold on me. Oh, I'm gonna sing it out.
Oh, I'm gonna sing in the middle of the storm. Louder and louder, you're gonna hear my praises roar. Up from the ashes, hope will arise. Death is defeated, the King is alive. He's alive.
Come on, church. You sing this with us. Let's hear you shout it out like you really mean it this morning. So sing a little louder.
In the presence of my enemies,
Sing a little louder.
louder than the unbelief.
Sing a little louder.
My weapon is a melody.
Oh, sing a little louder. Come on, church.
Heaven comes to fight for me.
Sing a little louder.
In the presence of my enemies,
Sing a little louder.
oh, louder than the unbelief.
Sing a little louder.
My weapon is a melody.
Oh, sing a little louder.
Heaven comes to fight
One
for
more time. Come on.
me.
Sing a little louder.
In the presence of my enemies,
Sing a little louder.
oh, louder than the unbelief.
Sing a little louder.
My weapon is a melody.
Sing a little louder.
Heaven comes to fight for me. Sing a little louder. I'm gonna sing in the middle of the storm. Louder and louder, you're gonna hear my praises roar. Up from the ashes, hope will arise. Death is defeated, the King is alive. Oh, I'm gonna sing in the middle of the storm. Louder and louder, you're gonna hear my praises roar. Up from the ashes, hope will arise. Death is defeated, the King is alive.
Can we celebrate the King is alive this morning? Come on, let's praise him. Come on. My Savior died, He paid the price for me. Was crucified, suffered all so I can be lifted up, covered by grace so free. The Lamb of God, His mercy rescued me. Rugged cross where my final debt was paid, a borrowed grave where his body once was laid, an empty tomb, a stone he rode away. Let all the earth declare his holy name. I will sing to the one seated on the throne. I will sing to the one who saved my soul. No other name is worthy, no other name alone, and no other name but Jesus. The water of grace, a king would take my place, a sinner lost with a heart so full of shame. And all along, your mercy called my name. So let my life be filled with endless praise. Oh, we lift you up, Lord, and I will sing to the one seated on the throne. I will sing to the one who saved my soul. And no other name is worthy, no other name alone, and no other name but Jesus. Sing it again now. Yes, I will sing to the one seated on the throne. I will sing to the one who saved my soul. No other name is worthy, no other name alone, no other name but Jesus. There's no other name, Lord. We worship you. Oh, we thank you, Lord. You're so good. Thank you, Lord. Thank you. Until that day when my eyes shall finally see those nail-pierced hands reaching out for me, and there at his feet my fear and pain will see. I give my life to praise the King of Kings. Come on. And I give my life, hey, to praise the King of Kings. Oh, give him your praise now. Hey. Yes, I will sing to the one who's seated on the throne. I will sing to the one who saved my soul. And no other name is worthy, no other name alone, and no other name but Jesus. Hey, and I will sing to the one who's seated on the throne. Yes, I will sing to the one who saved my soul. 'Cause no other name is worthy, no other name alone, and no other name but Jesus. Yes, Lord. No other name but Jesus.
There was nothing beautiful about a Roman cross. It was made out of rough lumber, a simple crossbeam, either at the top or nailed partway down. Some had a protruding piece at the bottom where the victim could rest his feet. But crosses were not attractive things that you would use to decorate your house. Nor was the person hanging there a thing of beauty. A beaten, bloody body is not a pleasant sight. In prophetic word about the suffering servant, Isaiah said this in Isaiah chapter 53, "There was nothing beautiful about his appearance, nothing to attract us to him. But today, the cross is used as a thing of beauty. I tried to find a picture of a typical Roman cross on the internet, but what I found looked too nice. We use precious metals to make it into jewelry with which we adorn our bodies, or we use fine lumber to make a beautiful replica to decorate our churches. And for a long time, this kind of struck me as ironic. Picturing or thinking of the cross as beautiful surely must be misleading. I mean, how can a cruel and ugly instrument of execution be turned into a thing of beauty? How can we do such a thing? Well, we can't, but God can. He transformed it by placing Jesus upon it. In his book, Beauty Will Save the World, Brian Zond points out that the unique form of Christianity is the cruciform. Christ upon the cross, arms outstretched in offered embrace, forgiving the world of its sins. This is the one beauty, he says, that saves the world. And the symbol of this saving grace is the cross. And he goes on to say that the Roman cross, an instrument of physical torture and psychological terror, could ever become an object of beauty representing faith, hope, and love is an amazing miracle of transformation. Every cross adorning a church in itself is a sermon proclaiming that if Christ can transform the Roman instrument of execution into a thing of beauty, there is hope that Christ can, that in Christ all things can be made beautiful. However, it must be said as well that to see the beauty of the cross in all of its glory, as with many beautiful images, we must stand in the right place. It must be viewed from this side of the resurrection. It has to be seen through the prism of the resurrection. And from that perspective, we can join with the hymn writer to say, in the old rugged cross stained with blood so divine, a wondrous beauty I see. For 'twas on that old cross Jesus suffered and died to pardon and sanctify me. And as we see him on the cross, let us also hear his words spoken at the Last Supper, "This is my body given for you. This is my blood which is poured out for you." How beautiful is that?
I remember your broken body, your blood and tears so overcoming. I remember you took bitterness, you bore my shame, you bore my sickness. Break the bread, drink the wine, come sup with me. Break the bread, drink the wine, come sup with me.
Sometimes this world makes no sense to me. I'm torn between what others want and what is me. It seems a song is what the world demands, but how can I sing in this strange land? Until I die, I'll sing God's song, living in this Babylon, always looking for the shore of the world that I was made for. The world where the weak are finally strong and the righteous are known for righting wrongs. I want to see this earth start shaking, being impacted by a powerful generation that is finally waking up inside. And on the final day when I die, I want to hold my head up high. I want to look God himself in the eye and tell him that I tried.
There was a question and answer time with a highly effective CEO, and many young aspiring business people wanted to try to find out what the secret was to this man's success. And one young man asked, well, what's been the most important reason for your incredible success? And the man thought for a minute, and then he said, good decisions. And the young man kind of dug a little bit deeper, and he said, well, how do you learn to make good decisions? And the man said, experience. He said, well, how do you get experience? And the CEO said, bad decisions. Today we're embarking upon a short study of a man who didn't make too many bad decisions. The life of Daniel is one of the most unusual biographies in the entire Bible. I mean, here was a man who spent almost his entire career from the time he was a teenager all the way to the time that he was an old man in positions of influence and authority in highly visible public life. And yet there was not a mark against him. And that can't be said of Moses, who killed a man. That can't be said of Noah, who got drunk. It can't be said of David, the man after God's own heart, who committed adultery and even murder. But Daniel is just one of a handful. He's one of a handful out of hundreds of Bible characters who kept the faith continuously. Now, don't get me wrong here. Daniel wasn't perfect. But he was a faithful example for the long haul. And in our day and age, we might compare him to a person like a Billy Graham, a person who stood the test of time and maintained his morality, his purity, his integrity, and his character. And that's kind of the way Daniel was. It was Edwin Markham who said, choices are the hinges of destiny. Choices are the hinges of destiny. Now, Daniel himself wrote this book, the book of Daniel, but he didn't do it in a grandiose manner. Instead, he did it in a very matter-of-fact style. And although we'll be concentrating upon several examples of deep commitment to God throughout this series, it's important that you understand some of the background. The theme of the book of Daniel has to do with the sovereignty of God. And as you can see, I've entitled this series, Daniel and the Dudes Who Dared to Be Different. And the reason these guys dared to be different was for the very simple fact that they had a great relationship with God and that they wanted to live for Him. They stood in awe of God and they had a reverence and a respect for Him as well. And there's something else that you need to know about the book of Daniel. You need to know that the book of Daniel is to the Old Testament what the book of Revelation is to the New Testament. So much so that many liberal scholars try to dismiss the book altogether as being fictitious. Or they say it was really written some 400 years later than it actually was because some of the prophecies and predictions it contains. Some scholars say, well, there's no way that it can be authentic. But the prophecies are true. In fact, that's why Jesus chose to quote from the book of Daniel on several different occasions, because he believed in the authenticity of Daniel. And he knew that God's inspired writer, Daniel, had placed those in the book so that people would know that this was God's word. Now, Daniel was a very young man when his country of Israel was taken captive by the Babylonians. The nation of Judah had been carried away captive from their land to the land of Babylon, some hundreds of miles away. And Daniel had three of his closest friends that were with him, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we're going to talk a little bit more about them in the next message as well. But they were chosen to be trained to serve in the palace of King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, can you imagine what it must have been like for Daniel to be carried away captive to the land of Babylon when he was in his teen years? I mean, it must have been a terrifying experience for Daniel and for his buddies to be uprooted from their homes and everything they knew and carried off to a foreign land. But the reason for the captivity of the Jews was a combination of two different things, really. One was that there was a terrible king over Judah at that time. His name was Jehoiakim. And Jehoiakim had absolutely no regard for God's word. In fact, he even one time cut out portions of the Old Testament with a knife, and he tossed them out of the scrolls. And then the other reason was because of the conniving king of Babylon. As I've already pointed out, his name was King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, it's important for you to realize that Babylon was the center of idol worship. And so you ask, well, why would God allow his chosen people to be taken to an idol-infested region? Well, it's important to understand that at that particular moment in history, the Jewish people had, for the most part, departed from their worship of God. And now they were beginning to turn to idol worship. And so I believe that God was sending them to the capital city of idolatry for a very good reason. He was in essence saying to them, I can't cure you of your addictions to idols. And so I'll take you where they had their origin, right back to the source. And there you can learn what idolatry is really like. For 70 years, you can experience those idols that you so desperately want to serve. And that's precisely what happened. But after those 70 years of captivity, they lost their desire to bow down to idols. Well, this morning we're going to talk about 5 different decisions that Daniel made. And I hope that when we're through, that you'll understand a lot more about not just Daniel and his character, but also about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And even more importantly, I hope when we're done, you will understand the purposes of the book of Daniel and how it plays into our own lives. To begin with, Daniel decided to remember his godly heritage. Look at Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 through 5 this morning. It reads, In the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, and he put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. Now, Daniel remembered his godly heritage. And maybe that's why some of you are attending church today, because you were raised to be in church on the weekend and raised to be in church for Bible study on Wednesday or Thursday night, and you've remembered that heritage. Well, the same was true of these guys, and also with Daniel as well. Nebuchadnezzar was an incredible military strategist. But in addition to that, he was very wise. And so he wanted the finest young men, the finest young people in the land to work for him. Jerry Vines says this. He says, these are the ones that the devil wants the most too. Those with keen minds and promising futures. If the devil can corrupt them, he will go a long way toward destroying our land. But Daniel decided to remember his godly heritage. And so Daniel and these dudes had a choice to make. They had to either choose faith or they had to choose fear. Now, as a young man, Daniel had witnessed the horrors of war. The brutal Babylonians had stormed his homeland. They had burned homes down. They had raped the women. They had killed the soldiers, and children had been ripped from their homes. And so Daniel must have been terrified of them. And remember, he was born into royalty. He probably had, a silver spoon in his mouth. And usually those in that kind of setting, toughness doesn't come automatically for them. And even the Babylonian officials themselves were terrified of the king. And so Daniel had to be lonely. He had to be afraid. And yet he makes a dramatic choice in choosing to remember his godly heritage. This is, in a sense, an Old Testament microcosm of Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2 in the New Testament, where the Apostle Paul says, "I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." And so Daniel was faced with either conforming or else allowing the Lord to transform him through his strength. Do you remember the episode of the Waltons? Maybe you were like me, you grew up watching I grew up watching every episode of that show. But this is the episode where John Boy is going off to college. And his dad just couldn't bring himself to say goodbye. And it was kind of an emotional episode. Now, I never really understood why he had such a hard time saying goodbye to him. I kind of thought he would be happy about it, since that would be just one less person that he had to say goodnight to each time they went to bed at night. But it was always tough on his dad to say goodbye. And in this particular episode, everybody else had said their goodbyes to John Boy, and they'd given him their particular advice. And finally, as John Boy was getting on the train, his father walked over to him and said just one phrase. He said, "John Boy, remember who you are." And that was it. Well, Daniel chose to remember who he was. He chose to remember his godly heritage. But the second decision that he made was that he decided to honor his distinctive name. Look at verses 6 and 7 of Daniel chapter 1. It says, "Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel the name Belshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego." Now, I'm certain that this was a little bit confusing to them, to get used to being in a new culture, and all of a sudden people are calling them by a different name. And you know what? Names have always been important to people. I like the story of the preacher that tried to kind of bluff his way through with members whose names he couldn't remember. He had a way that he would always try to determine, to try to figure out what a person's name was. And as the people were filing out the door one Sunday, a lady came up to him, and he knew that he should know her name. And so he went back to his old faithful trick. He said, now help me out here. Do you spell your last name with an I or with an E? And she looked at him and was kind of perturbed, and she said, "With an I, Hill." I couldn't decide between two jokes this morning, and since some of you were probably a little slow in getting that one, I'm gonna give you a second choice. The other one I've thought of is this. It's pretty sad when you have to keep throwing out jokes until people finally get one, but when Donald Trump was feverishly campaigning for office several years ago, he was trying to get votes anywhere that he could. And so one day he went to a nursing home, and he was talking to some of the different people there in the home. And finally he approached this little old lady who was sitting in a wheelchair, and he stooped down to her level, and he said, "Well, hello there." He said, "What's your name?" She said, "My name is Mary." Then he said, "Well, do you know who I am?" She said, "I sure don't, honey. But you know what? If you go over there to the front desk, they can help you." You probably didn't like that one either. Sorry, but I don't have a third one to share with you. Let's get back to the message here this morning. The point is, names have always been important to God. The Bible tells us that names mean an awful lot. And I think it's kind of interesting how God allowed Adam to name all the different creatures. And God also changes some people's names. You know, he changed the name Abram, which meant exalted father, to Abraham, which means father of many nations. In the New Testament, Jesus changed the name Simon to the name Peter, because that meant rock. And he said, "Upon this rock I will build my church." But Nebuchadnezzar had a reason for his madness. There was a reason why he wanted to change these guys' names. What we miss out on when we look at this in the English is the fact that all four of those guys had names that brought glory and honor to God. Daniel's name meant "God is my judge." Hananiah meant "Jehovah is gracious." Mishael means he who is that is God. And Azariah means "the Lord is help." And so evidently they had parents who had a faith in the Lord and who wanted to give their sons names with spiritual significance. But Nebuchadnezzar was not content to let these boys have names that reminded them of their faith in God. And so Nebuchadnezzar gave each of them names having to do with idol worship. Belshazzar meant Bel, who was the chief Babylonian god. It meant Bel, protect my life. Shadrach meant I am fearful of God. Meshach meant I'm despised by God. And Abednego meant servant of Nebo, who was another Babylonian god in their minds. And so you see what they were doing? They were trying to remove from the minds and the hearts and the wills of these young men any commitment to God. And in exchange, they offered the king's meat and wine and a place at the king's table. I mean, it was a small thing to give up, their old names. But you know what? Big decisions ultimately rest on little decisions. Years ago, a young soldier who had fled in battle was brought before the fearless warrior Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great said, "What's your name, son?" And the boy kind of hung his head dejectedly and quietly and said, "Alexander, sir." And the courageous leader barked out, "What is it?" And the boy looked up and quietly said, "My name is Alexander, sir." And the fearless warrior looked at the boy and said, "Change your name or change your conduct." And if you're a Christian, you bear the name of Jesus Christ and are His representative. And it's your responsibility for others to be able to see that. Zenith had a slogan that they used for many years. You may recall it. The slogan said, "The quality must go in so that the name can go on." Well, Daniel took that seriously, and so must every Christian. But there's a third decision that Daniel made, and that was he decided to honor God by what he ate and drank. Look at verse 8 that reads, "But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way." And so these Jewish young men were assigned food and wine from the king's table. And it was probably a pretty attractive spread. And the taste and the presentation, no doubt, were fairly elaborate. You know, when our kids were young and our family would go out of town on a trip and we were staying in a nice hotel when we were at a convention or something, one day during the stay, I would say to the kids, okay, we're going to splurge this morning and you guys can get room service. And boy, their eyes would light up and they couldn't wait. My kids got such a kick out of seeing the person come rolling that tray in, carrying the plates with those little lids on them, and they love to take those lids off. And it's really neat to watch your kids, drink $6 worth of orange juice in a shot glass in 2 seconds. But they got such a charge out of that, and I got a charge out of that as well. A real charge is what I got out of that. And this must have been a real treat for Daniel and the dudes. But there was only one problem. According to the Old Testament Jewish law, Daniel couldn't eat the food or drink the wine. You see, the Levitical law that the Jews adhered to prohibited some of the meats that Daniel was offered. It also prohibited the way that the food was prepared. You see, the Jewish people were told in the Mosaic law how they were to prepare food, and probably some of those foods were prohibited by the commandments found in Leviticus 11. And they were defiling, and they weren't to be eaten by the Jews. And as far as the wine went, in Babylon, any wine that was consumed was considered a form of an offering or a toast to the pagan gods. And all meat was offered in worship to Bel Merodach, or one of the other gods of Babylon. And therein lies the decision which Daniel was faced with: eat and drink, thereby sacrificing his spiritual conviction by acknowledging that they were pagan gods, or else do what God would want and face the consequences of a ruthless king who had no regard whatsoever to human life. And just let me point out that none of the other Jews were objecting. In fact, they were just glad to be alive, and they were happy to have something to eat at all. And it would be so easy just to go along with the program and rationalize and say, hey, you know what? We're captives here. We're in a foreign land. We have no option. This is such a small matter anyhow, and I'm sure God will understand. I mean, it's just a tiny little exception. After all, everybody else is eating it. But I like what the Living Bible paraphrase says. It says, Daniel made up his mind not to eat the food. You see, spiritual battles oftentimes begin in the mind, and they are won or they are lost in advance. Somebody said, sow a thought, reap a deed. Sow a deed, reap a habit. Sow a habit, reap a character. Sow a character, reap a destiny. And Daniel was decisive. If you have a tough decision to make and the time comes to make it, don't be wishy-washy. Make the decision. Make the right decision like Daniel did, because from the mind it moves to the heart. The King James Version says Daniel purposed in his heart. The Babylonian masters could change many things about Daniel's life. I mean, they could change his homeland. They could change his diet. They could even change his name, but they couldn't change his heart. And everybody else was eating the king's meat, but Daniel said, no thanks. I'm not going to eat that meat, and I'm not going to drink that wine. He would not compromise his convictions. Well, the fourth decision that he made was that he decided to submit a wise proposal. Look at verses 9 through 14 of Daniel chapter 1 that read, Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. And so this official is pretty honest about this. He's saying, hey, I can't let you do this. I mean, this could come back to haunt me. I could get my head chopped off for this. But listen to Daniel, verse 11. It says, Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. You see, Daniel was very wise and discerning. Notice that he had a plan and he had a proposal of an alternative. Now, what if I went to Mike Sparks, the chairman of our elders here, and I said, Mike, I've got this great idea. You know, for the next 3 months, I think that I should sit down every time that I preach a sermon. I think we should replace this pulpit with a big lazy boy recliner, and I'll just kick back in that recliner whenever I preach for the next 3 months. Well, Mike might say, well, I'm just not sure the rest of the elders are going to go along with that, you know. And I'm not sure I think it's a really good idea. You know what, David? I think you're a nut. Now, he might say something like that. But what if I said to him, okay, Mike, let's propose it this way. We'll put this whole deal together and we'll test it out. For the next month, I'll fake like I've got a broken ankle. And then I'll sit in the recliner and I'll preach for the next month. And if after a month, all of a sudden the findings start coming in and we start looking at the statistics and it's just unbelievable to us. I mean, there's a support group here at the church for lazy people, you know. Let's just say there is. There's not really. So don't go looking for a sign-up sheet for it. But let's say the lazy people support group writes the elders and they say, well, we think this is a great idea. We're so inspired and encouraged by seeing people sit down on the job. Nancy Nelson, our secretary, may say, man, I can't believe the statistics. I mean, attendance has doubled in worship since David started sitting down. People feel like it's a fireside chat, you know. Larry Heschke, another one of our elders, says, boy, we can't keep up with the decision cards. We've had twice as many decisions for the Lord. And Joe and Dixie Draper, who record our weekly offerings, come up and they say, you're not going to believe this, but our offerings have doubled since David started sitting down to preach. Kirk Nelson, another of our elders, says, I really like it, because now David can't see me as well when I start dozing off to sleep. Now, this is just purely hypothetical, okay? Now, if that were the case, and all the information and all the statistics came in like that, then we might say, well, you know what? I think we might need to do that. I think we ought to try sitting down to preach every week for a while. Well, Daniel had a plan, and he was ready to be turned down. And as soon as he was turned down, he said, you know what? I've got an idea. In 10 days from now, let's look at the statistics. Let's look at all the evidence after 10 days. The proof is in the pudding, so let's give it a shot for 10 days and find out if I'm right. And so he had this plan all laid out. He wasn't arrogant. He wasn't obnoxious. He wasn't defiant like some Christians act. Daniel didn't make unreasonable demands. He didn't go on a hunger strike. He didn't make a scene and rebel at the training table and spit out the pork. He simply asked permission not to violate his conscience. And you know what? When you dare to be different, remember that Daniel did so with a positive attitude, that he acknowledged that he was accountable to a boss. Daniel didn't try to go behind the guy's back. Instead, he took the proper course of action. And something else that stands out to me in this story is that apparently Daniel's bold stand didn't turn people off. Daniel's bold stand served to inspire others to follow his example. And as a result, they joined in with him. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel chose to honor God by what he ate. But in doing so, he ran the risk of ridicule, and he dared to be different. Peter Marshall said this. He said, if a man is not willing to stand for something, then he is liable to fall for anything. And how true that is. Steve Ropecki is a Christian businessman who lives in Southern California. Several years ago, he was at an insurance convention, and the guy who was speaking at this convention, every once in a while, he apparently felt the need to season his presentation by taking the Lord's name in vain. He did this time and time again, and it just really galled Steve Ropecki to the point where he couldn't stand it anymore. And so finally, in the middle of the man's speech, Steve Ropecki stood up on the seat of his chair and he pointed his finger at the speaker and he said, "You leave Christ out of it." And then he hopped down off the chair and he sat back down. Well, after a few seconds, everybody settled back down and the man resumed speaking. But the man didn't take the Lord's name in vain anymore either. Not throughout the rest of his talk. But do you know what the amazing thing was? After that man finished speaking, there were more people that came up to shake hands with Steve Ropecki than did the man who delivered the speech. You see, people respect a Christian who is willing to take a stand. And they might not be able to show that in front of the crowd, but off to the side, there is a respect and an admiration that you have the guts and the courage to stand for what is right. And that's the way that Daniel was. Well, the final decision that he made was that he decided to use his influence to glorify God. Look at verses 15 through 20. Verses 15 and 16 are really a little bit humorous to me. But it says, at the end of 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. And so the guard took away their choice food and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. Now, I think that's kind of funny myself. I mean, here they were used to eating country ham, and now all of a sudden, all they get is broccoli. Verse 17 reads, to these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them. And listen to this. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And so they entered the king's service. In fact, in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. What a powerful testimony. And all because of some of the little decisions which led to some big results. You know, I don't know if we really grasp how powerful our testimony is and how much influence we really have on those who observe our lives, even in the little decisions that we make in life. I mean, what do people observe when they see your parenting? What do people see in your life when they see you at work? What do people hear when they see you upset? Or when the call doesn't go the way that you want it to? Or when your team loses? What type of conversation comes out of your mouth? What type of belief system do you embrace? What type of values do you espouse? What type of a God do you serve? Do you stand in awe of Him? And does your lifestyle communicate that? You see, sometimes the evidence is so obvious that people can't help but see it. And that's how it was for Daniel. He knew how to make right decisions which would honor a sovereign God. Let me close by reading a paragraph for you this morning entitled, "The World Needs Christians." It reads like this: "The world needs Christians who cannot be bought, whose word is their bond, who put character above wealth, who possess opinions and a will, who are larger than their vocations, who do not hesitate to take chances, who will not lose their individuality in a crowd, who will be as honest in small things as in great things." Christians who will make no compromise with wrong, whose ambitions are not confined to their own selfish desires, who are not ashamed or afraid to stand for the truth when it's unpopular, and who can say no with emphasis, although all the rest of the world says yes. It's true. Remember this: choices are the hinges of destiny.
Worthy of every song we could ever sing, worthy of all the praise we could ever bring, worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you, we live for you. Jesus, the name above every other name. Jesus, the only one who could ever save. Worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you. Oh, we live for you. Holy, there is no one like you. There is none beside
face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. The Lord bless you and keep you. Make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. Amen. 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 Shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. As we receive, we agree. Amen.